well. Leibovitz, the writer about the topic of ethical pluralism versus monism, has helpfully characterized the distinction between ethical monism and pluralism as follows. Now, forgive a little bit of technicalia. Monists claim that there is only one intrinsically morally relevant property, call it P, and that any action that exemplifies P is morally right. Pluralists maintain that there are several intrinsically morally relevant properties, call them properties P1 through Pn for some number n, and that for each intrinsically morally relevant property, P subscript, there will be a presumptive principle. That is, for any action A, if A exemplifies this principle, then it is presumptively morally right. A monist, for example, could operate as an act utilitarian and judge the rightness or wrongness of any action by whether it satisfies the one and only moral principle, and act A is morally right just in case A maximizes utility. Or perhaps our monist is instead a divine command theorist and judges actions by whether they satisfy the principle, and act A is morally right just in case A is commanded by God. Importantly, however, the monist must choose which property is the one and only correct one, since monism excludes the possibility that there is more than one such property. The ethical pluralist, on the other hand, instead of the monist, does claim that there are many morally relevant properties and related principles, all of which should be weighed in any judgment of the morality of an action or situation. So, an ethical pluralist would have to consider the morality of an action from a variety of ethical perspectives rather than one, and could, for example, see how an action is morally wrong without being morally wrong according to every principle. Leibovitz argues in favor of pluralism because it seems to him that intuitively good moral advice, like you might have gotten from your parents, think before you act, cannot easily be justified by appeal to the monist assumption that all morally good acts exemplify one single property. Some instances of good actions based on this advice may exemplify one moral property, and other instances, other properties. Furthermore, pluralism explains, quote, how it is that the plurality of factors that agents consider when they reflect on and deliberate about the status of an action are morally relevant features of that action. Returning to our example, a person made aware of the racism involved in the earlier example of the cab driver may consider the morality of the situation and his response along any number of moral lines. Does the situation or his response maximize or fail to maximize utility? Violate or uphold the dignity of a rational being? Live up to a virtue or commandment, or some of these and not others? Whereas a monist is free to dismiss the moral significance of the situation or his response in case it does not run afoul of one principle, the pluralist has to worry about many. To the extent that this account better captures the nature of how a morally sensitive person actually reflects, and is likely to make us more sensitive to the diverse range of moral complaints and wrongs that can be seen when we shift our moral perspective, it is a better and more useful meta-ethical position than monism. Ethical monism may serve to weaken our powers of moral perception by narrowing the focus of our moral perception to a subset of all the possible moral properties that we should be sensitive to. It facilitates seeing the world through a somewhat rigid frame of reference. Palazzo and Hoffridge, earlier mentioned, described the tendency to filter out a diversity of perspectives as rigid framing. Rigid framing makes it difficult to transcend a specific view on the world and adopt another, different frame. As a consequence, it prevents people from compensating for the blind spots in their frame and from developing a deeper understanding of the situation. When one is a monist and is not mindful, the two tendencies can enhance the odds that the subject will exhibit moral blindness. The failure to see the situation as a moral situation may be aided by the narrow prism through which the monist sees the moral landscape, a landscape where only a single property should elicit moral reflection and concern. Furthermore, one may develop a tendency to short-circuit any moral reflection that does take place by simply assuming or rationalizing to the judgment that the action or inaction satisfies one moral principle. With only one moral principle, it is perhaps easier to find a way of discharging a moral complaint. or concerns in terms of that one principle. I believe that ethical pluralism is the kind of ethical framework that one finds in the Indian philosophical and religious tradition. So here again, it is an area where we can improve our ethical lives by embracing aspects of Eastern thought. In the West, ethical pluralism is a relatively recent postmodern development. The bulk of our tradition has instructed us that one or the other moral theory is dominant, if not absolute. Indeed, much instruction in these moral theories emphasizes the incompatibility between their moral standards. For example, Kant's explicit rejection of utility in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. In the Indian tradition, however, the collected moral insights of the Gita, the Vedas, and the Upanishads resist classification under the umbrella of a single moral theory or property. Chaudhry, a commentator on East-West religion and philosophy, discusses the moral flexibility and sensitivity to context found in the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. Quoting him, "No action considered in its outward form can be described as intrinsically and absolutely good or bad. Under certain circumstances, it may be a greater evil to kill than to be killed. Under certain other circumstances, it may be a greater evil to be killed than to kill. The final criterion is furnished by the consideration of the ultimate good of humanity, or the establishment of the higher values of life, such as true justice and freedom in human society. In employing this criterion, we cannot blindly follow any pre-established general principle or set of principles. There is constant need for independent thinking, intelligent reliance on competent authorities, and critical self-examination. The refusal to follow the line of least resistance or the blind conformity to some general principles is indeed a hard way. It requires a certain ruggedness of the soul." So, in closing, I suggest that we try as best we can to take on that ruggedness of soul for ourselves, expose ourselves to the diversity of moral standards and perspectives that the pluralist outlook engenders. It seems at least plausible to assume that this would help to prevent injustices from escaping the scope of our moral awareness, open, as it is now, to the possibility of more moral properties than one. I believe we should feel bounded, not simply by one moral code or perspective, but by all that can reasonably apply to our given circumstances. We must take on the injustices that are not easy to see because they remain hidden in our moral blind spots. An attitude of mindfulness and openness to a plurality of moral paradigms will take us closer to this ideal. That's it. Okay, so thank you guys. Sure.
Well, your description of mindfulness is what I have viewed as empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It really offends me that most people operate based on a consequence of learned behavior.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even make a moral judgment. They have their own self-interest. The person that cuts off someone in traffic, to me, is never really a nice person.
Maybe not. I mean, if they were put under pressure and you asked them, "Why'd you do that?" I'm sure they wouldn't just say to you, "Well, I'm a bad person. I do bad things."
I'm in a hurry.
You know, they'd say, "They're in a hurry."
I'm
So
in
they
a
would.
hurry.
That's appeal to some kind of moral reasoning. It's like, well, if I don't get there on time, that's worse than if I cut you off. So you're inconvenienced a little, but my inconvenience is more.
I am really offended by people's lack of moral conscience,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm also offended by people that think that it's better to not judge other people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's very trendy right now.
Mm-hmm.
No
Yeah.
matter how horrible someone is,
Mm-hmm.
don't judge them. you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Extreme relativism in the way people think about ethics is, I don't think, helpful because it serves to sort of numb and dull out your capacity for making moral judgments. Which, if it's not, I think, to borrow the analogy of perception, if it's not used, you might lose it, right? I think it becomes less sensitive over time if you don't actively practice thinking about issues in a moral framework. Right?
And our life experience from childhood shapes us in a way that is often immoral.
That's right, and we have to unlearn bad habits, and we have to be able to see where we're conditioned to ignore things that are wrong in the world because they don't affect us.
But mindfulness is the only way to get past that, is to really be aware of the consequences of your decisions.
That's right. When people are careless and so on, this is the kind of counter example of what I'm talking about. Right? When a person just goes through life not taking much heed of the moral reality of a situation unless it's really explicitly obvious, like, should I steal from a person? Okay, no. Right? Most people are not going to just generally go about doing as much deviant stuff as they can, but they still let slip a lot of bad behavior that other people do, and sometimes their failure to respond to that just becomes further contribution to the perpetuation of the bad state of affairs. So these are the kind of things which I think we should take a hard look at ourselves. Why should we try to protect ourselves from the intellectual self-criticism that this implies? I think we should take the harder path, and that's why I chose the quote at the end about how we should have a rugged soul. Why should we try to conceal from ourselves the harsh moral judgments that might be appropriate to us? Don't you want to improve as a human being?
Exactly.
You do. So that doesn't just mean drawing a circle around whatever you already do and saying this is correct. You have to sometimes be willing to make criticisms, and you're in a good position to make judgments about your own behavior if you're mindful. Yes?
On the other hand, many people call...
Oh, sorry, I was calling you, but you
Oh,
go
I'm
ahead
sorry.
then.
Many people call a decision that they make a moral judgment
Yes.
when there are no moral issue involved.
Right.
For instance, we've all been judged by the clothes we wear.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
That does not involve a moral judgment.
No.
And yet, we have many people who believe it's a moral judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, is where we need to learn to be accepting of people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Not in things that are truly moral and require a judgment, but in all the areas that do not require judgment, and you should be accepting. Just because they act slightly different than you
Mm-hmm.
does not mean that it requires a moral judgment on your part.
No. I mean, no one would say, let's manifest moral questions where really there ought not be any. Like whether a person wants to eat, let's say, tacos or pizza for lunch, and we construe this as a morally charged judgment. So, I don't want to have it overstated, the extension of what I'm trying to talk about, but I totally agree with you. Sometimes people are judged harshly based on aesthetic choices and lifestyle choices that really don't actually amount to any kind of morally relevant factor. So I would agree with you on that. Yes?
Yeah.
Oh, well, sorry, but I called on her previously, so.
I think these ladies understand what I was trying to say before.
Mhm.
It's because we don't expect people to act decently,
Mhm.
and we don't reward people who do, and
Mhm.
the people who don't, we try to understand them
Right.
and give them excuses. It's getting worse and worse and worse to its society is getting unbearable to live with, your neighbor.
Yeah.
I mean, here, we're lucky.
Mhm.
We're all of the same age group, which I think is what makes us all nice to each other.
Mhm.
We were brought up with the same, do unto others as you would have them do you.
Mhm.
But you go out there, you go out into the madhouse,
Yeah.
people from all over, in different states.
The thing is, we all have to live
different morals.
together. We all have to live together. It's not a world just for some people. It's for everybody. So.
I understand, but there is a certain moral, you know what is right.
There is, yes, I believe that. I believe in moral realism. Part of the concept that I'm defending is that there's something to be seen in the world when we are just attuned to the moral factors at play. So I'm not a relativist or anything like that, and I do believe there is some type of, moral reality out there. But I don't think the
there's
way
a
of getting
problem.
to it is necessarily to just put blinders on and to just say, I'm only going to consider a really narrow range of my own behavior as having any moral significance. I think we should try and, in a way, scrutinize ourselves more actively than a lot of us do.
Well, I know, but I'm saying, I think.
It's
it
not just for
doesn't
other
help.
people, though. I feel like the one thing about your comment that I don't 100% agree with is the way you're trying to assign the negative responsibility to other people. This is supposed to be something where you look inside yourself and try to find gaps in your own moral perception.
Oh, right, no, but I'm just saying, I've noticed that over the years, people act worse and worse towards each other. And I don't understand why it continues to get worse and worse.
Well, it starts with you. So you've got to just
That's
make the
true.
changes that you want,
That's
and
true.
then we'll see how other people act. But ethicists, moral philosophers, people trying to drive the culture forward in whatever field they're working in, I think are trying to bring about a new consciousness on some of these issues. And it's not just I don't think it would take it the right way to just say, let's try and fix other people. This is supposed to be a bit of intellectual self-criticism. Importantly, the blind spots, they're your blind spots or my blind spots. The blind spots of other people are things they're going to have to do work to notice. But being at least apprised of what these factors are and how we can be maybe sometimes in that category, I think that's illuminating, and it helps the person orient themselves a little bit differently towards the decisions they're making all the time. At least to bring it into your active consciousness instead of allowing it to be something that's unnoticed. At least that's a general goal of the paper. Probably not going to achieve, but did you have something too, guys?
Yeah, but why don't you take him first and we'll.
Sorry, a hand, yes.
Okay, I was going to ask, is there, if you're doing moral perception, just about just for yourself,
Yeah.
is there some standard that you can relate your activity or your thoughts to so that you know when you arrive at the right place?
Well, I mean, we're not infallible, so we're never going to just have like a guidebook that gives us all the instructions for us to just follow as though we've got no critical input into it. So that would be hoping for too much. I can't say that there's a simple statement of rules like the 10 Commandments or whatever that everyone should just be appealing to. At the end of the paper, I defend pluralism. So I'm basically saying take a grab bag, take a bunch of different moral principles, apply them all to your behavior, and then let's see what comes out of that.
But to some extent, what's happening in our society is that people are taking the moral perception questions and putting them into codes,
Mm-hmm.
and then saying, here's the, here and here and here is the right
Is that what you
thing.
think the primary problems are in society? Government overreaching its bounds or something like that? I don't think that's my
No,
perspective.
I'm not.
Well, you said putting it into codes. What do you mean, like
What
laws?
no. Once you codify something,
Uh-huh.
then you're taking it out of just, let's see,
Informal.
free behavior
Uh-huh.
and saying, no, you've got to conform to this.
Well, yeah, but pluralism, if at least what I'm trying to defend as pluralism, it doesn't say rely on only one code. It says that there's validity to a variety of different moral intuitions. So, what I think usually does happen is a person appealing to one code uses that to somehow justify a whole range of unethical behavior. Whereas if they were open-minded to at least a few alternatives, then they might be able to see the complaint that other people are making. I just think we should be a little more sensitive to moral complaints, not try to rationalize away the injustice or the immorality of someone's moral complaint. Try and see it from that perspective according to which it is wrong, and then try to act according to those intuitions, even if they're not yours. Yes?
Are you, okay, I go first? Oh, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have a Greek philosophy group here too.
Mhm.
And there's a few people here that are doing Greek philosophy. So, you make mention of the work of Aristotle.
Yeah.
In Kant, and I have a question, and it's hard for me to
Yeah.
put it together. But
Okay.
it has to do with the fact that Socrates talks about virtue,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you make a connection between virtue, and I'm wondering, and I think both Aristotle and Kant also thought of virtue as being a priori. This is not a statement, it's a question on my part.
Virtue as being a
So
priori.
I'm wondering if you want to expand or say something about virtue along with the theory that you're proposing here.
Well, virtue, according to the Aristotelian tradition, is the development of a stable disposition of character over time through a process of learning and trial and error. So you don't just get born as, let's say, the courageous person. You have to be placed in situations where you have an opportunity to be either courageous, foolish, or cowardly, and you have to, he thinks, try over time to hit the right mark, which he describes it as hitting a mean between two extremes. So he thinks of courage as a median between rashness and timidity or cowardice, right? So he thinks that how you're going to get to that point where you just instinctively do the courageous thing, and this is only one virtue, right? I could have mentioned generosity. Generosity, he thinks, is in between being wasteful in the giving of gifts and being stingy. So generosity is right there in the middle, right? So he keeps describing virtues as this kind of intermediate stance between two polarized opposite vices. So the vices are on the extreme and the virtues in the middle. And how do we cultivate the virtue? Through the practice of acting as the virtuous agent does by, in some cases, imitating the behavior of the virtuous man or woman until it becomes second nature for us. So it's something he thinks of as highly related to action in the real world and practice. The cultivation of virtue is not something he thinks you can do from the armchair. Because, for example, if you have been put in a situation where bravery has been called for, you don't yet have the virtue, even if in principle, sitting back in an armchair, you're like, yeah, I would do the brave thing. So does that make sense to you? It's more driven by action, and it's not so principle driven. He also thinks that depending on the circumstances, the same action could be either required by the virtue or forbidden by the virtue. So there's a sensitive matter of context. That is why I think Aristotle is a little bit anti universalized principle. You see, he thinks there's fine judgment that has to be made in how to elicit the virtue in each case, and it will only be shown through the behavior. It can't be shown by a person's mastery of words or their ability to articulate in writing what their moral positions are. So to me, I see at least a distant analogy between what Aristotle was talking about and my own thought here, even though I guess what I would be talking about would be a subset of his discussion, but it's a specific subset, the part that deals in having at least the moral awareness of the factors around you as you go through real life situations. It's something that you can't just teach yourself from the confines of your room. You have to really go out and actually work on it by being in the real world. So I think there's that connection. Is that?
So just one last, so that would mean a change from Socrates or Plato, right, even, in terms of a priori.
Well, a priori. I don't think that Aristotle discusses it as an a priori thing. He thinks that knowledge of the virtue is only going to be gained by observation of real life exemplars. And since that can only be done through activity, which happens after experience, I think he believes it has a significant a posteriori component. I believe that the rationalists like Descartes, Kant, and others are more in the a priori tradition. And it's disputed by scholars how to interpret the ancient Greeks, Plato. Because Plato's source is Socrates, who is in some ways interpretable as more an Aristotelian manner of thinking. Plato himself, the disciple of Socrates, is a little more theoretical. So that's a disputed scholarly question. Yes?
I was just going to say that, you know, if we live in the love, if we live in love, not to be, I'm not going religious exactly,
No.
but if we live in love, we love each other, we love ourselves, and we love whoever made us. You've got the sort of a situational ethics in a sense, in that you're more mindful. You're not just living by the rules, both biblically or country rules. You have, like you say, to do something at this time might be more wrong than doing it at this time.
Right.
So it's a situational ethics of a sense, but you really, that's what you're talking about, is really living in love and awareness.
Yeah, I think that we sometimes shield ourselves from the awareness of how even inaction can contribute to the perpetuation of an injustice. Because no one likes to think of themselves in these negative moral ways, right? We all think of ourselves as basically good people, and generally we are, but we also always can have a little room for moral improvement. Not just intellectual improvement, but we can also morally improve a little bit, or physically, fitness, anything, right? So this is just another dimension of human capacity that I think we have not made as much progress in some cases as we possibly could. And I think that by focusing too much on these other three moral failures, this is obscured. If you think that moral failure has to arise from one of these three sources, then you will only really charge someone with doing anything immoral when they made a self-conscious moral decision that was bad or whatever. But what if a person didn't even recognize that the surrounding situation they are involved in has some morally salient features? Then we can't easily classify them as doing something wrong according to one of these three criteria. And then it just seems to escape the notice and the criticism of anybody. So I think, you know, this is an important thing, especially now that we're all talking about implicit bias a little more openly.
So that situation that you just talked about, an example of that might be a husband just told his wife he's going to leave her, he's having an affair, she's going to her mother's, and she can't think straight, she can't see, she's doing everything wrong, she hits somebody, she runs red lights. So that would be, she's not exactly aware because she's going through something. That's kind of what you mean by that
Well, I
one?
mean, yeah, that could be an example where the person's doing things that are harmful to others throughout and without any active consciousness of how they're doing it. Yeah, that's the general idea, but you know, I choose my examples a little differently because I want it to be a little harder on all of us. Because if you don't find yourself in a panic situation a lot of times, you might think, well, I'm not really doing this too often. But you know, what if you don't really support the right causes? This is something that might apply to more of us than just the case you mentioned.
Like, what do you, for example?
Black Lives Matter, let's say that. Maybe a person that says there's no real good moral complaint from the Black Lives Matter community and it's just a bunch of rabble-rousers causing trouble and destabilizing society. I think that they're actually making a negative contribution to the solution. So, I mean, that's my opinion, but I don't want to pick on that case. There's a lot of cases like that, though, where I think a person, through doing nothing, is actually helping keep the status quo in place, whereas they should be offering their voice of support. And if they were a little more morally perceptive, they might realize that silence is actually helping the status quo. Yeah.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on the jihadists,
Yeah.
especially the lone
Yeah.
wolves.
You're thinking that they
And
have a moral
that-
code or something?
That kill and use
Mhm.
women and children.
Yeah, no, not a fan.
I know what I mean. How did they get there?
Well, I mean, I would say that this is an extreme interpretation of a kind of, religious moral code. And we've seen many cases, not just within Islam, but, cult movements and other things like that.
Brainwashing.
Where people interpret a moral code to say things that are actually wrong to do. And in that case, I think there's a higher standard of morality above and beyond, one particular moral code. The whole point of the end of the paper I'm saying is pluralism. So I'm not saying one idea or worldview reigns supreme and that's the one that we should all look at. I'm saying the opposite of that. I'm saying we need to look at the whole diversity, the whole kaleidoscope of moral views, and take them into serious consideration as we go about making decisions about how to act or how not to act. And do so in a mindful way so that you don't sort of limit your attention to a few factors, making life easier for yourself, more pleasant. I don't think that's the way we should do it. Sorry, but let me make sure I get to a few more. I'll get you next and then him first, okay? Is that all right? Yeah, go ahead.
Would it be fair to interpret your difference between monoism and pluralism in the statement that we need more sources of guilt?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have enough sources of guilt for ourselves.
Yeah, I think we should allow ourselves to feel more guilt.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
That's definitely something I believe. Yes.
Oh, I was saying there can be situations where there's an extreme ambiguity as to what the actual good is.
That's
I
true.
was thinking in the case, for instance, the decision to bomb Hiroshima.
Uh-huh. Famous
there were
case.
at least three other alternatives to bombing Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And the weight is, well, how many more people are going to die if those
Yeah,
other...
utilitarian judgment usually is the one that is appealed to in that case. People say that the dropping of the bomb prevented a larger loss of life because it immediately ended the war.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
the argument anyway.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, there were other alternatives, of course.
Yeah, there are alternatives. There are other arguments. I've heard, counterfactual supposition that Japan was ready to capitulate, that there could have been a less belligerent way of getting their peaceful surrender. There have been those arguments too. So
Well,
go
yes,
ahead.
of course, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I just wanted
To highlight that as a case in which there are definite moral differences of moral intuition. And maybe if you consider all of them, then you'll be able to come to a better judgment in the end. I don't know. The case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is obviously a huge debate in ethics literature and social science and history.
No, my point was simply that the good is not always easy to discern.
Not always easy to discern, but because it is so complex, I think we need to give it its due in terms of our course of reflection. We're really shortchanging the act of moral reflection, which is a delicate and complicated matter, if we simply adopt to the most convenient moral theory that justifies any aspect of what we're currently doing. The point of ethics, after all, I think, is to be normative, not to just say, here's what we do, and by the way, it's good. It's to try and guide us towards norms of right behavior, which, unless we are somehow really lucky, we have to work on over time. Because there's no way, I think, that ethics is just going to say to you, go ahead and keep doing as you're doing, and everything you do is correct. Everything you're a part of is correct. That, I think, is actually using the system of ethics to rationalize bad behavior. And that's kind of what I'm speaking against in this paper. I think that the edifice of Western ethics has functioned too often to justify and rationalize bad behavior. And it would not do that if we were willing to entertain a more full range of moral theories, some of which will say we are doing things wrong. And let's take it seriously. Instead of just trying to find the easiest, safest, secure method of feeling good about ourselves and everything we do. Why should we want to live that way when other people are complaining? And in some cases, people that are not other people are complaining. Okay? That's what I think. What else?
Yeah, one thing I struggle with is ignorance.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So much of it, I think, is just learned behavior,
Mhm.
maybe from childhood.
Yeah.
Or from church, or wherever you
Mhm.
determine your moral code.
Yeah.
It's hard to be forgiving of ignorance when I really think inside a person, they know right from wrong, unless
Yeah.
there's something really wrong with them. Because
I do kind of share that assumption. I'm pretty optimistic about our capacity to orient ourselves in the right moral way. I think that we do have a kind of capacity for perceiving ethical situations. It's nothing that the animals have, where it's just live and let live by any means necessary. We can delay the gratification of an impulse because we know it's wrong, right? So even if I'm hungry, if I'm a human being, a member of society, knows that I shouldn't steal because it's someone's property, right? Even if there were no legal sanctions against it, I think we have some kind of awareness of these things because we're intelligent, because we use language, and because we know about these concepts of right and wrong. So holding ourselves to a higher ethical standard than the animals is definitely something I believe in. And to the extent that we make it easy on ourselves by just assigning no negative responsibility to any of our behaviors, I think is really unfair and dishonest, as if the bad people are just bad guys out there like a cartoon, and there's just angels and devils. It's not the way the world really is. Yes?
I do have to speak up for animals.
Okay, no, I love animals.
More and more animal studies show
Okay, fair
definitely
enough.
moral code, sharing.
Some of them, right? Some of the higher mammals.
Elephants,
Mhm.
chimps, even
Yeah.
crows.
Sure, fair enough. I was just saying, highly specialized ethical behavior is not often seen. We have property and so on that we respect. Animals couldn't even conceive of the idea of, here's a stake of land, or, some things you need language to be able
But
to.
on their level.
But you're right.
they're
Animals of a kind cooperate with each other. Sometimes, they'll sacrifice even life and limb to protect offspring, and so there's a kind of unity and a nice moral community, maybe, in some dim sense that they do.
And I do find, we've been out here 3 years,
Mhm.
and I think the amount of diversity is fantastic.
Mhm.
I mean, you go to the Spectrum or Mission View Mall or
Mhm.
South Coast Plaza, there's all kinds of different
Yeah.
ethnic groups
Oh, yeah.
that get along just fine.
Mm-hmm.
It really seems very encouraging.
Well, it is good, and it is encouraging, but you got to remember, that's a recent innovation, and it's not the forces of the status quo that made it that way, right? If you go back in time 50 years, you
Right.
wouldn't see that diversity.
No.
But
And
we
so
came
more
from
the
the
people
Midwest.
pushing the status quo in the right direction, people that are not encouraging us to just do as we always have done, people that are challenging us to think a little bit bigger and more critically about topics like that. So, I think there's definitely room, not for radicalism or anything, but just for the advocacy of a little bit more expansive moral point of view.
I don't know that people consciously think about it, but I don't think they seem to care.
That's the moral
What
blind
color
spot, that's what I'm
their
saying.
neighbor
It's not
is,
so much
what
on
color
going
their
out trying to be
neighbor
evil and malicious, it's just,
Yeah.
in my day-to-day life, I don't see morality, I don't see the opportunity to do right and wrong things. The person that goes their whole life that way, maybe, unknowingly perpetuated or participated indirectly in a whole bunch of bad things and
But I mean, they
never raised a
don't
voice.
care that they
No, you're
shop.
talking about something different.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
talking about people's ability to accept diversity.
Yes.
We moved here from Missouri.
Uh-huh,
They
uh-huh.
don't
Well, yeah.
accept diversity like they do out here.
True.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, no, but it's good, and it's a salutary aspect of this region, right? Southern California and California overall.
but there's plenty of prejudice out here too.
There is, and I'm just trying to say,
Yeah.
when you look to make improvements morally, you really have to look a little deeper beneath the surface of even your immediate surroundings, because injustice is everywhere, and therefore I think you have to have also kind of a more global view. That takes a little far from where I've spoken today.
And the thing I struggle with the most is weakness of the will.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah, there's a lot of people that want to do the right thing, but they
Sometimes-
find it just too hard or
yeah,
something.
sometimes you just don't have the strength to
Mhm.
think differently. I mean, it's just your
Mhm.
impulse, especially, we all have a different way of being brought up, but that comes up in my life all the time, an impulse that I've had since childhood.
Mhm.
And I know it's wrong,
Mhm.
but it still keeps popping up. And
Yeah.
I talk to myself and I try to correct it, but it still keeps popping up.
Yeah, but at least there's this much to say for the person with the weakness of the will. They still feel a little bit of pull towards doing the right thing. And when their weakness of the will overwhelms their moral judgment, they still feel maybe guilt about it or a guilty conscience. So that's better than the malicious person who's like, yeah, I want to do the wrong thing and I love causing pain. There are sadistic people out there. Yes.
I don't know which category you would put this scenario in,
Uh-huh.
but it's a scenario that probably bugs me more than any other scenario out there,
Mhm.
is when I realized that the individual did not act because they refused to think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You mean there's a classic case of Kitty Genovese, you ever heard of that one?
No.
Manhattan high-rise New York apartment. This woman she basically, you know how in New York there's all these really closely cluttered apartments. So you have people on your left, right, above and below, and they can all hear everything that's going on, thin walls and so on. So you had Kitty Genovese living there in Manhattan in a high-rise, I think it's the 70s or something. And she one day was getting attacked by some intruder, and the person was killing her, doing everything, and she's screaming bloody murder. Help me, help me, help me, top of her lungs as loud as you could hear. And in fact, there were a whole bunch of people at home. And they were above, to the right, left, below her. They all heard, and they all thought, that doesn't sound right. Maybe someone should do something. But this is a phenomenon that they discuss in psychology texts and that I'm aware of called the diffusion of responsibility. That when you're in a big group, okay, and it's not like you have had any kind of designated role to take responsibility for fixing the situation. In that kind of scenario, everyone feels the same way, like, well, I'm not obligated to act, and someone else will probably do it. And by feeling in that way that they're not personally responsible, guess what? Nobody takes action. And that's kind of, I feel like, an analog to a lot of problems in our society, to just connect it to your thought, right? A lot of people not doing anything, and so it's normal to not do anything. Over time.
But not doing anything. When you make the conscious decision not to do anything because it is not your responsibility, is at least thinking through the action.
It is, at least thinking through the action.
Okay, I'm talking about people who don't even start to think through the action. They get behind the wheel of the car, we used this one earlier here.
Yeah.
And they come up to a light, for instance, and they make a right turn.
Yeah.
Now, there are 2 right turn lanes. They do not think 2 minutes ahead to get into the second right turn lane so that they can get it into the third lane when they make their right turn.
Inconsiderate behavior on the road.
No,
Right?
it's not inconsiderate.
Not even inconsiderate, because that would mean that they thought of it and then
Is their failure to think and put their mind into action to say, okay, what do I need to do immediately?
Well, yeah, I mean, mindfulness is something that I think across the board is going to help people prevent, it's an act of cognitive self-monitoring. So like thinking about your own mental activity in a situation that you're in. So if you're mindful, you're probably going to be better on the roads, unless you're a malicious person that just thinks you're the only person in the world that matters. And then you've got a different problem, not just that you're not mindful, but that you're not nice and you're a mean person. Yes.
Your proposal of mindfulness entails a lot of work on the part of the
It does, yeah, it's a lot of labor.
And not only a lot of labor, but a lot of time, because if you go from 0 ability to be mindful to becoming mindful.
Well, the thing is, I see where you're going, right?
It's going to take a lot.
It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of cognitive resources, so is it fair to ask people to do it? I just think we kind of owe it to each other, though, to do it, because when we're talking about ethics, we're not talking about purely self-regarding behavior. In fact, if there was no other regarding dimension of a person's behavior, I'd hesitate to call that really an ethical decision. So, yes, it's work. Yes, it requires intellectual self-scrutiny and monitoring. But I think you owe it to other people because you don't live in the world by yourself, and these other people they place moral demands on you. So it's like your job to live up to these moral demands that other people are putting on you, even if you don't see it immediately. So that would be my guess response. And by the way, I don't think that it involves such an overwhelming amount of mental exertion that it's an unreasonable demand. And at the very least, people should do more than nothing, which is, I think, the default of a minute.
But it does take a lot of time to looking at your inner self.
Yeah, if it becomes a habit, I think maybe it gets easier over time. I don't know. 1 second. Yes?
Do you consider or think that a part of moral blind spots is a part of a social or emotional intelligence to follow the crowd so that you're not accountable?
Intelligence? I don't know if I would call it intelligence,
No,
but
emotional intelligence, where you just follow the herd. You know,
is that intelligence? I would think of that more as kind of instinctive behavior, not governed by.
I'm thinking of if you're in a group mentality and you're
Yeah.
following the group mentality, it may not be for the benefit of the whole, but you just do it because if you step out of line because you feel that it's correct to do it this way, the group now is going to turn
Yeah.
on you. So you
Yeah.
just follow the norm. And like my dad used to say when we were growing up, well, you're gonna follow your friends off the cliff too, kind of a thing. So do you think that the moral blind spots is encouraged by emotional intelligence? So
Yeah, and in some of the literature, people talk about that. How I talked for one brief moment in the paper about rigid framing. When you have one frame of reference that you think about the world morally through, and you don't really consider alternatives to it, and within that rigid frame of reference, it might be just as long as I'm treating me and my immediate family good, then nothing else is wrong that I'm doing, right? So where do those rigid frames come from? I do think they come from a pattern of social behavior that we're all, in some ways, socialized into from a very early age. And so patterns of injustice and misconduct become normal. And no one complaining about them within our sphere of social experience and concern, then it becomes a comfortable way for us to disengage from the issues too.
Right.
Again, my paper is like a call for moral improvement on the part of the reader. And if a person doesn't see any room for moral improvement, I think they're not being really entirely honest with themselves intellectually or emotionally. So take it optimistically that I do believe people have the ability to improve themselves, but we're rooted in a way in some habits that take us away from seeing the full span of morality that is very important and always around us. Few people, but you haven't spoken with you, so maybe I could just.
The comment was made earlier that there's a general degradation regarding the people's treatment of each other.
Mhm.
But in my personal experience, and I've bicycled through 7 different states over the last 40 years or so, and by far the vast majority of people that I ever encounter are always very nice. It's just the few that are the bad people.
Right.
But when you focus on the media, yeah, there's an endless supply of bad things done. And
Well,
I have one question regarding your scenario about the taxi with the white man and the.
Lawrence Bloom scenario, but I appropriate it, yes.
Okay, so if the situation would reverse, if the man was black and the woman and her child were white and he took the taxi, would that be racism?
Well, I believe racism is something that's not individual but social, and I think the beneficiaries of racism are white people, and those that are harmed by racism are people of color, non-whites. So there can be personal prejudice. An individual, let's say person of color, can have a prejudice in favor of the moral superiority or whatever of others like them, but I don't think that that constitutes racism, which is, in my view, systemic. If you think about, I don't know, just to take one easy example, disparities in access to housing and housing segregation, which kind of just extends Jim Crow in a de facto sense without having the backing of law. You know, if you cannot apply for the same loans, if you can't take up rents in the same buildings, and we all know that it's not like a light switch just flipped when the Civil Rights Act was signed, and all these negative and hostile attitudes that black people are inferior caste of human beings, second-class citizen, etc., maybe even an inferior order of human beings. Those things didn't just disappear overnight, like with a stroke of a pen by the president. And we're still living in the shadows of slavery and segregation. And so, you know, disadvantages have accrued over generations to members of disadvantaged communities. And people that look like me and you, we're not members of those disadvantaged communities, even if there may be occasional circumstances in which we're treated unfairly. And yes, of course, the people that treat you unfairly, if they do so on a racial basis, shouldn't do that, and that's wrong. And maybe they should, engage in a little bit more moral perception on their end. But I don't like this thing about reverse racism, because to me it is unfair to charge the victims historically of racism with racist attitudes. They're the ones that are still suffering through the legacy of racism that's been stood up and reinforced through generations. And I would take it the wrong way to think, oh, I'm a victim of racism. No, I'm privileged because of racist attitudes. People like me get a lot of advantages. We don't get stopped by the police. When we do, we're not assumed to be murderous. So I think there's a huge difference, and it needs to be addressed, and that's why people are complaining. Yes?
So I think in summarizing your whole paper, from what I get out of it is you are talking about social intelligence, which is a real thing, a real study now.
Mm-hmm.
And social intelligence means living in consciousness versus subconsciousness.
Yeah, trying to bring the things that are just sort of for our own self-preservation relegated to the realms of our unconscious or subconscious, and bringing those out front and center, not sparing ourselves the full awareness of moral complaints. And again, I think that happens automatically, unconsciously, without the malicious ill will of easily identifiable immoral agents, right? So this is a little more subtle, and that's why the discussion has to proceed by making all these fine distinctions in the classification of immoral and moral behavior.
Thank you.
Yes, and, sorry, well, I want both of you to speak.
The
Who would like to go first? Who would like to go first?
This is just an extension
Okay.
of that. In terms of the consciousness, I think it makes it even stronger consciousness if one gets out of their internal self and looks at everything kind of more more broadly.
Mhm.
Because even when you're driving, you take the heat of the moment, it's just the internal, it's just sort of like uncontrolled.
Yeah.
If you kind of pull out and.
I detect a lot of hostility in the room. For the way
Right,
people
so the
behave on road.
consciousness goes, the consciousness gets a little strong, a little better, a little bit more disciplined if you pull out and look at things more broadly.
Exactly.
And I think that that's kind of an
Yeah,
important way to.
this movement to be more
eliminate that.
mindful and more
Yeah.
sensitive to a variety of moral principles and complaints can be described in various ways. Broadening your view to include things beyond your immediate contents of experience, that's probably one way of describing it. And for future research, I'm sure a lot of more empirical study could be done. But there are at least a few now that are trying to trace connections between self-conscious mindful practice of mindfulness and then the record of moral behavior. It does seem to have a positive impact, at least according to some controlled studies that have been done, and it stands to reason, doesn't it? That if you're otherwise a good person, don't see yourself as bad, and you try your best to think a lot about acting rightly, instead of just only imagining that special situations call for moral judgment, then I think we'll all do better, and wouldn't we prefer to live in such a world, right? So anyway, that's what I'd say on that one, and then yes.
Well, a better example than Kitty Genovese is what you see on the news all the time.
Sorry, one last thing. Did I finish the Genovese? No one did call the police.
Right.
Because everyone assumed someone else would do it, and so she was killed and no one helped her. Okay.
But I mean, you see people going into raging rivers to rescue people out of cars.
Oh, yeah.
Even
great.
rescuing animals, you
Mhm.
see highway pileups where there's a burning car and people
Mhm.
pull the passengers out of the car.
There's a lot of good behavior, it's true.
And then the other point, and it's interesting now what you're talking about with Black Lives Matter.
Mhm.
I don't know what the subgroup was, maybe